Welcome to Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Story Talks is produced by Narativ, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Story Talks. As you all know, Julienne Ryan and I, Jerome DeRoy, discuss the ways on this podcast that businesses engage their employees and customers. We're always interested, in particular, in how storytelling and listening practices can help increase engagement, and in giving you all, our listeners, practical tools and advice that you can implement almost immediately once you go back to your workplace or even at your workplace as you are listening to us. We've been having a variety of great guests over the last couple months, and today is no exception because today we have our guest is Paul Browde, Dr. Paul Browde, who happens to be the co-founder of Narativ. And he's also a multi-hyphenated individual because not only is he a doctor, I also knew him as a performer, a psychiatrist, couples therapist, and really an overall guide for those with whom he works. And you can learn a lot more about Paul and his work at his website, paulbrowde.com, paulbrowde.com, and we'll give you more information about other things that we've been doing with Paul that you can connect with. So, Paul, we are delighted to have you, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So let's see. So of course, you know, I've known you for a long time, and we've it's almost like we've had different iterations of ourselves as the years have gone by. I think it's certainly true for me. But you know, there's this one constant that I've always known you as, and you know, that's around listening. And I was wondering maybe if you could tell us a little bit about your own journey around listening, but perhaps other things, and what kind of got you to where you are today in terms of this term that I lifted from an interview that a colleague of us did with you, of being a guide, you know, for leaders and other people.
Thanks, Jerome. Well, when I think of listening in my life, I think of myself at around 5 years old, sitting around the dinner table with my brothers who were 10 and 12 years older than me, and my parents who were obviously a lot older than me. And they would sit and talk and talk and talk about what was going on in South Africa at the time. It was the height of apartheid. There was a lot of conversations about politics and morality and ethics and words I never understood at 5 years old. And I just sat and listened and listened and listened. And at a certain point, I remember the day, I just started crying at the table. My mother said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Nobody ever listens to me." And so at that point, they designated pudding time. In South Africa, we call dessert pudding. And they said, pudding time is Paul's time. It's where he gets to speak, which is why I've always loved pudding so much. Still do to this day. But I spent as a younger child and having these very involved parents. My father was a human rights lawyer. My mother was an oncologist and a politician, and they were very involved in their lives. And I would do a lot of listening to them and hearing not only what the world saw, but I also heard what was going on behind what the world saw. And I heard, you know, my mother was a politician in the world, and at home she was very anxious about public speaking, about being out there in the world, and I got to hear all that. So a natural progression for me was to go to medical school, and medical school really shaped the way that I listen, in that I was taught how to listen for what is wrong and how might I fix it. I mean, that's really what medicine is about. It's like, what's the diagnosis and what is the treatment?
And then when I was in my 5th year of training, we would arrive at the hospital in the mornings and they would allocate patients. They'd say, who wants the kidney failure? Who wants the heart disease? And then who wants the dying patient? This one's this one's going to die. And no one wanted the dying patient because they felt there was nothing to learn. But I wanted the dying patients because I was always very anxious about not being able to do the right thing medically. I might kill someone, but if they were dying, it took away a whole lot of anxiety, and I could just be with the person. And I had some of the most amazing conversations with people who were dying, people who I would never otherwise have come across, who in those last days became incredibly open and sharing of their experience. And I remember one old woman saying to me, honey, live your life, enjoy your life, because that's the most important thing. And this was a complete stranger. And so at that point, started to realize that it wasn't about me finding solutions necessarily, but it was about me being present to listen to what was happening to other people that was helpful. And then later on, a couple of years later, I found myself in the very strange position of being diagnosed with HIV. And that was a tremendous shock to me and absolutely terrifying. And so I shut down, and not only could I not speak, but I also had a hard time listening at that time. You know, Maya Angelou says, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. And that's how I lived for some years, because there was this story inside my body that I couldn't tell anybody. And through a series of circumstances in which somebody found out and then used that information to really blackmail me in some ways, to emotionally blackmail me, I came to the realization that the only thing that would free me from this tyranny of the untold story was to tell my story. And I went to the American Psychiatric Association conference, and I was part of a group. There were actually 4 of us, people, all psychiatrists with HIV, and we all told our stories to this room of people. And it was a watershed moment for me, because the telling of that story liberated me and allowed me to be much freer with who I was. So when we talk about bringing one's whole self to work, I would literally leave that part of myself when I came to work at the door. It wasn't allowed in before I told about it, because I feared that I would lose my job. I feared that no one would want to come and see a psychiatrist who they knew had HIV. So I just pretended it wasn't there, and I segmented it out of my experience and went to work. But it caused me tremendous stress. So I had panic attacks. I felt shortness of breath. I used to get lightheaded and dizzy, and I was always worried that someone would find out. Once I had spoken it, it wasn't that I went to work and spoke about it to everybody, but I could bring that part of me with me to work. And that allowed me to be fully present in my workplace and be able to listen and become, I believe, a better doctor and a better psychiatrist. And then, I went on to part of the experience of being someone with HIV, which nobody knew, was hearing how other doctors spoke about patients behind closed doors. And not all doctors, but there were some doctors who were very demeaning. They said horrible things about people with HIV. I would never share a glass with one of them. They say you can't catch it that way, but I would never. Or someone would come in with HIV and they say, oh, he's a goner. And one doctor presented a case of an HIV patient saying, this is a 28-year-old schpoz. And there was a medical term I'd never heard in South Africa, but then it turned out to mean subhuman piece of shit. And that was so devastating for me, to be talked about in that way, but for the person not to know that they were talking about me. So he thought he was talking about that person out there, and I knew that he was talking about me. And so I was very influenced by that and began to realize that there is no us and them. whoever we think of as them, if we get close enough to them, we realize it's us. We are all connected. We all share a human experience. And yes, the flavors of our human experience are all different, but there's something essentially human that we do share. And that's very much influenced my work and how I listen. So I listen to people in, well, so let me just, I want to get to the word guide, because I love the word guide. And I've been influenced by a wonderful teacher who I would love you to have on this podcast. Her name is Heidi Schleifer.
Oh, yeah.
And Heidi Schleifer teaches couples how to visit one another's worlds. And so the idea being that in a couple, you are two very separate worlds, but you can visit one another across a narrow bridge. And I can be a host to you as you visit my world, and then you can be a host to me as I visit your world. And the job of the therapist is to be the guide, not to provide the answers. Content is not up to the therapist, just the guidance of how to make the journey across the bridge. And more, I'm beginning to see that people have the wisdom and knowledge inside of them. They don't need to be told what to think or feel. What they need is the guidance to get into a place where they are free to feel it and to know what their inner knowledge and their inner guide is telling them. So these days, that's my chosen profession, is to be a guide.
That's beautiful.
And they're telling words and guidance for what we've been experiencing as a culture, as a country, in the last few years. So what advice would you have for others about how to play that listening and that guiding into their own life right now?
Yeah, that's really, I think that we've got to start with ourselves. So we've got to start looking at how are we leading our own life. So what is it that you're waking up to in the morning? What's the first thoughts that are coming into your head? And to just take a little time to become aware of the thoughts that are coming in, to be aware of the feelings that you're living with, and to see if there's a way in which you can choose how you would like to be for the day. It's really about leadership of the self, so being a guide to yourself. I think that all leadership must start that way, because I think people lead in the way that they lead themselves. So if you lead yourself with compassion and kindness and openness, you are going to tend to be that way with other people. I think that at the moment, we are all, and I don't want to say all because maybe I don't know this. So I would say it makes sense to me that there is a tremendous amount of grief in the world right now. If you just, in the United States, imagine for a moment that nearly 1 million people have died in the last 2 years of COVID. And that is not just that 1 million people are 1 million households, 1 million families, 1 million networks. That's a lot of people. And even if we don't personally know people, we know people who know people. And there has generally been a tremendous amount of loss. And so I think acknowledging that we're in a state of grief, and then remembering, I think Kubler-Ross was very helpful, denial, anger, bargaining, and depression are all part of the grief process. And I think we're seeing a lot of denial, which is, I don't want to believe that this has happened. It's not that important. It's no big deal. To anger at one another for, just anger at one another that's coming out everywhere. And, depression is also everywhere. And I'm seeing a lot of that. I see in my practice, people are having a very difficult time right now with all those feelings. And so what I can advise people to do, check in and notice internally, how are you reacting to yourself? If you're angry, if you're sad, if you're lonely, are you able to find compassion for that part of you that feels that way? That's the first step. and then we take it out into the world and into the workplace.
Mm,
Thank
mm.
you.
Wow, it's really beautiful and very moving. To think about what we've been going through as a society. I mean, globally, in those terms, and to look at it through this framing of grief. It makes a lot of sense to me. I can certainly relate to it. I have two young kids, and I think about this all the time. All the families that have been completely broken apart, and kids who've lost their parents because of COVID. That always touches me in a very particular way. And yes, and of course we see all these effects everywhere. And so I guess I'm wondering, we talk about leadership quite a bit, and I know you work with leaders, and we've worked together on this program called Purposeful Leadership. How do you see that transferring to the business world, this thing that's happening globally, that's touching every community, every human being on earth, this lens of grief? How do you think that impacts a business, or well, let's forget about a business, but just a leader and their team, for instance? Like I'm thinking about those people in our program, Purposeful Leadership, and what they might be going through and get out of something that's called purposeful leadership, where we're actually looking at this stuff.
Yeah. It's interesting when we talk about story, there is always a story being told in our experience, always. Life happens and we story it. That's just the way the human being operates. Now, some of those stories are invisible to us. And one of the stories that I think guides leaders is the story of what is it to be a leader. It's an old story, and I think it's similar to that story of being a young doctor, which is, what is the problem and how can I solve it? It's about being the one who knows it all and who's out there making it happen. And anything that doesn't fit in with that doesn't belong in leadership. That's for people to deal with outside, or go and get help, but don't bring that to work. And I don't mean that harshly. I mean that that's actually the story that people have been told. But what is a good leader? I think the story of what it is to be a leader is evolving. It's shifting. You cannot banish people from bringing what they're going through at home, because they're at home while they're working. For the last 2 years, home has been work. You can put on the fuzzy background on Zoom, but you've still got the child running through the room. You've still got, all the things that are pulling you at home. So to pretend that it's not there doesn't work anymore. And as I said earlier, bringing my whole self to work didn't mean coming in and sitting and sobbing and using work as a place for really delving into my feelings. But what I've found very useful, and I think this is what leaders have to allow, is there needs to be some space for people to bring what's going on at home into the workplace. And I think leaders also have to, part of the new story is that they don't know. Because quite honestly, I hear this every day from people saying, I don't know where we're headed. I don't know what's happening. There are so many variables, and it's not just COVID. I mean, COVID is like a symbol of what's going on. Climate change, we're hearing about this all the time. We don't know what's going to happen in the world in the next 20, 30 years. And it's very unpredictable. So for leaders to pretend that they know, I don't think is helpful. I think what's helpful is to say, look, I also don't know, but I'm willing to lead you in the not knowing. Let's generate some way of being. And I think ways of being, rather than what are the actions we're going to take, are a place where leaders can put their attention. So can we be collaborative? Can we be listeners? Can we be creative? Can we be positive and uplifting, but in the face of the not knowing? That for me is the beginning of a new leadership paradigm.
I'm so glad that you brought up this idea of ways of being, because I find that to be extremely helpful in my own life when I noticed that, because it really is a mindset, isn't it? That I think what you're talking about is sort of changing the mindset from, knowing everything or having to know everything and pretending to know everything, to not knowing, embracing that, and then, finding a way of being. How does one, is it simply conjuring the way of being? Is it, do we, how does one get to a place where, you might be able to shift from one way of being to another way of being? Like even taking the example of, shifting from knowing everything to, or thinking you need to know everything, to accepting that you don't and communicating that way. That's quite a, it's quite a change.
It is. I think it's a process, and I think it's what leadership is now, is that process. It's a responsibility to do it, but it's not easy, because what's much easier to start off with is to just fall into what's already there. So when you wake up in the morning, to fall into being worried, anxious, afraid. Some people luckily fall into being enthusiastic and passionate and open, but most people, in my experience, don't, myself included. I don't just jump out of bed excited every morning. So the first thing is to just stop and be with yourself for a moment and notice what's there. Notice, what are you feeling? Notice that you have a body that you live in. I think so. It's interesting to me, we've seen each other's heads and up to our chests mostly for the last 2 years. That's what we've seen of one another. And it's almost as if we're disembodied. And I can't help wondering if that's come into our feeling about ourselves as well, that we really don't exist below the nipples, So I think remembering you're a whole body, and you are a whole person taking up space and having a life is the first step. And when you start to do that, you notice your breath coming in and out of your body. And that's a practice that a leader can engage in with staff, is just reminding people to breathe, reminding people that they have a whole body, that their feet are on the floor. Then to see what is just there, what is the habitual thinking. And in narrative, we would talk about it as obstacles to listening. So if I'm angry, if I'm stressed, if I'm hurried, if there are many different obstacles, I can't really allow myself to create a new way of being. So I have to become aware of those. And as I said earlier, to find compassion for those parts of myself that are worried, just be able to internally say, I understand you're worried. It's a scary time. It's probably a young child part of myself. So the whole idea that we are made up of different parts, I find more and more compelling. And there are child parts that really are afraid, and all we can do is say, I know, I get it. I get how afraid you are. But once we've recognized all those parts and we've recognized those difficult feelings, we can say, how do I choose to live today? How am I choosing? And what intention, what shape can I bring to my day? And can I bring openness? Can I bring appreciation? And practicing that. So once you say, I'm going to bring appreciation, is actually speaking appreciation to people and to yourself. That's the work of leadership. Now that takes, at first it may take time. It's a practice. Right. It's literally waking up every day and spending some time doing that. And then you bring that into the workplace. And you don't have to do anything different, but who you're being has now shifted, and it's going to make a difference.
There's so many points that are compelling, but what I like is you are guiding us to step away from maybe the illusion that's been out there in our culture that you can commoditize leadership, and that it's almost like a manufactured product that people become, versus you're saying this is a holistic experience. Whatever is informing your background is going to impact your world, and our responsibility is to connect with people and keep growing as we go. So that all, it's a different approach. And I think it's a much more compelling approach and an important one for people to think about. And as you're saying, a lot more work to do inside and in here as we're doing it. But I think that's important. That is something to think about and reflect on. I think that's going to be definitely a pull quote out of all the articles we've written. This is going to be a very important podcast for us to share.
So interesting, you know, as you're speaking, I'm realizing something, that I relate to leaders as them. That thing that I said earlier, there was no us and them, that they were me. And I look at leaders, oh, they are the leader. That's who leaders are. That's not me. And we must not, we can't confuse leadership with the role that people have. So if you're CEO, oh, he's the leader. If you're the president, oh, he's the leader. But actually, or she's the leader. But actually, leadership belongs to all of us. It is a way of being leadership. We can lead, first of all, ourselves. We can lead our relationships at home. We can be leaders to our children. We can be leaders to our parents. And then we can be leaders in the workplace, even if we don't have the role of leader. Sometimes the most powerful leaders are the people who aren't in the role of the leader in the workplace. And so, yeah, I think it's about really reclaiming leadership as a birthright, that we all have it, we're all entitled to it, and we all have the responsibility of it as well. You know, you can influence a workplace very powerfully as a member of the team in both directions. You can be a very negative and downward pull to the environment, or you can support it and lift people, no matter what your role. I'm just hearing that right now.
Yeah, I really love that you know, what you just said, that leadership is a birthright, I think, and that we tend to look at leaders as exactly it's us and them, or increasingly us versus them. It seems to be that everyone is kind of against their leaders, and certainly in terms of politics and things like that. But even I think in businesses, it's happening too. Last question from me, which is how do you see the role of storytelling in this paradigm shift that you've kind of described, this mindset shift, where, you know, you go from being more and more aware and you know, coming up with a way of being, and then speaking that way of being, and being that, and showing up that way. Your actions kind of show up that way. What's the role of story in your view there?
Well, I think the first is what I said earlier about the fact that there is always a story being told. So becoming more aware, and I call it the stories that tell us. They're not stories we tell. The story actually tells us. They bring us into being, and becoming aware of those and deciding whether or not we choose them. And it can be very, very complicated when you see there's a story running your life that you're not sure you want to embrace. But noticing it is the first thing. But then knowing that it is through storytelling, through sharing our most personal and internal experience. And it doesn't have to be the worst thing that's ever happened to you. It can be really something that just happens right now in this moment. It can be an endearing story of something that happened with your kid. But the sharing of what happens inside of you connects you with other people and reminds us that we are connected. I think the source of greatest pain in the world is the illusion that we are not connected, that we are disconnected, and that we are ultimately alone. And through the sharing of stories, we can connect across divides. Sharing of opinion, beliefs, ideologies, we'll argue forever. But saying, this is a story that happened to me, we can all identify with that, no matter where we come from. And I think that's profound, because on the one hand, it's a one-to-one connection, but on a deeper level, it's the reminder that we're all in this together. And I think that's everything. So I see story as particularly powerful and important.
Yeah, and this has been an incredibly powerful conversation. Jules, do you have any other questions or words to add?
It's just one phrase kept popping into mind when you were talking about bracing leadership in us, and it belongs to everybody. And it was a phrase I learned from a Japanese friend of mine years ago. I cannot say it in Japanese, but essentially it was from the grass up, that when you're making change, it can happen everywhere and around. It's the common person's privilege to do that. It's not coming from up there. So and that inspired me in workshop to say we own it and we can make a difference. And it's the beauty of coming together to listen and learn that teaches us. So we are always learning, and I think that's the beauty of the work we're doing.
Yes, absolutely.
And be part of it on a given day.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the work that we do in the world, I want to leave our listeners with a few things and resources that they can go to. First of all, to learn more about Paul's work, go to paulbrowde.com, paulbrowde.com. That's his website. You'll learn a lot of things about him, but you can also ask Paul about keynotes and public speaking addresses for your company. I know that I've experienced Paul doing this, and it's fantastic every time. And of course, we run a program for purposeful leadership that Paul actually runs. And this is really helping leaders connect to their purpose. And so a lot of what you heard today is really connected to this program. So that's something that you can bring into your company as well. And of course, as always, if you want to learn more about Narativ, the producers of this podcast, and the company that Paul co-founded, it is narativ.com, narativ.com. If you want to hear more episodes of Story Talks, you can find that in any platform where you find your podcasts. We are hosted by buzzsprout.com. So if you go there, you'll get a lot more details about the podcast and notes and our guests, and you can go back to previous episodes as well. It's all free on that platform. So I want to thank you again, Paul, for being here today, and Julienne as well for being my co-host. It's really been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for listening so beautifully.
Yeah, and thanks to all our listeners who are here today. All right, see you next time.
Narativ Story Talks. For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narativ.com.